Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had heard the whispers since the day she arrived at Fort Reynolds. The other soldiers didn't think she belonged there. At 32, she was older than most of the men in her unit. She was also 5'4" and barely weighed 130 pounds. But what really bothered them was that she outshot every single one of them at the firing range. "Look at little Maria," Sergeant Davis would say with a smirk. "Think she's some kind of action hero." Private Johnson would always laugh along. "My grandmother could probably carry more gear than her." Even Captain Wright seemed to doubt her abilities. During training exercises, he would always assign her to communications or medical support. Never the front lines, never the real action. "Santos, you're on radio duty again," he'd announce, not even looking at her. "Sir, I respectfully request to join the patrol unit," Maria would respond. "The radio is important, Santos. We need someone reliable back here." Reliable. That word stung more than any insult. She knew what he really meant. Safe, protected, out of the way. Maria had joined the Army 8 years ago after her younger brother Miguel was killed in Afghanistan. She'd left her job as a schoolteacher in San Antonio, Texas, and enlisted the next day. She'd scored perfect marks in basic training. She'd earned her sergeant stripes faster than anyone in her class. But none of that seemed to matter here at Fort Reynolds. The base was located just outside the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana. It was a training facility for special operations, and Maria had fought hard to get assigned there. She wanted to be part of something that mattered, something that would honor Miguel's memory. But after 6 months, she was starting to wonder if she'd made a mistake. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Intelligence had picked up chatter about a terrorist cell operating in the mountains near the Canadian border. It was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Get in, gather information, get out. No contact with the enemy. Captain Wright called the team together in the briefing room. There were 6 soldiers total: Davis, Johnson, Martinez, Cooper, Williams, and Maria. The captain stood in front of a large map, pointing to various locations with a laser pointer. "This is a standard intel gathering operation," he said. "Will be inserted by helicopter at 0600 hours. The target is this abandoned mining camp here." He pointed to a spot marked with a red X. "We suspect they're using it as a supply depot." Davis raised his hand. "What about Santos, sir? Is she coming with us?" The captain looked at Maria, then back at Davis. "Santos will be our communications specialist. She'll maintain radio contact with base while the rest of you investigate the site." "With respect, sir," Maria said, standing up. "I've trained for this mission just like everyone else. I should be part of the assault team. Your job is communications, Sergeant. That's final." Johnson snickered. "Don't worry, Santos. We'll bring you back a souvenir." After the briefing, Maria sat alone in the mess hall, picking at her dinner. She thought about Miguel. He'd always believed in her, even when no one else did. When she'd told him she wanted to teach high school, he'd said she could inspire kids to believe in themselves. When she'd said she wanted to join the army, he'd said she'd make the best soldier they'd ever seen. "You've got something special, Maria," he'd told her the last time they talked. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But sitting there in that empty mess hall, surrounded by the echoes of doubt and dismissal, Maria felt anything but special. She felt invisible, that she didn't know that in less than 12 hours, she'd have the chance to prove everyone wrong. She didn't know that the simple reconnaissance mission would turn into a nightmare that would test every skill she'd learned and every ounce of courage she possessed. Most importantly, she didn't know that the very people who doubted her would soon be counting on her to save their lives. The helicopter was scheduled to take off at dawn, and Maria spent the night checking and rechecking her equipment. Radio, backup radio, emergency beacon, first aid kit, ammunition, water, rations. Everything had to be perfect. As she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, she made herself a promise. Whatever happened on this mission, she would prove that she belonged here. She would show them that being small didn't mean being weak, that being a woman didn't mean being helpless. She had no idea how much that promise would cost her. The helicopter lifted off just as the sun painted the Montana mountains gold and orange. Maria sat in the back, headset on, watching the landscape roll by below. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio, giving updates on their location and weather conditions. "ETA, 15 minutes to drop zone," he announced as Maria looked around. At her teammates, Davis was cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time. Johnson was studying the mission map. Martinez, Cooper, and Williams sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The mood was tense, but confident. They'd done missions like this dozens of times before. The landing zone was a small clearing about 2 miles from the target site. The helicopter touched down just long enough for the team to jump out with their gear before lifting off again. Within minutes, the sound of the rotors had faded, leaving them in the silence of the wilderness. Captain Wright's voice came through the radio immediately. Alpha Team, this is Base. Radio check. Maria keyed her microphone. Base, this is Alpha. Team radio check. Good copy. All team members accounted for. Roger, Alpha Team. Proceed to objective. Report every 30 minutes. Davis took point as the team moved through the forest. The abandoned mining camp was hidden deep in a valley, surrounded by thick pine trees and rocky outcroppings. According to intelligence, it had been shut down for over 20 years. The perfect place for terrorists to hide supplies. The hike took nearly 2 hours. Maria carried the heavy radio equipment without complaint, even though she could see the smirks on Johnson and Davis's faces every time she adjusted the weight on her shoulders. Let them think what they wanted. She'd carry twice as much if it meant proving herself. When they reached the ridge overlooking the camp, Davis called for a halt. He pulled out binoculars and studied the buildings below. There were 4 structures: a main office building, 2 storage sheds, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Looks quiet, Davis whispered. No movement, no vehicles. Maria set up the radio and made contact with Base. Base, this is Alpha Team. We have visual on the objective. No signs of activity. Copy. Alpha Team, proceed with caution. The team made their way down into the valley. The plan was simple. Davis and Johnson would check the main building. Martinez and Cooper would take the storage sheds, and Williams would watch the perimeter. Maria would stay with Williams and maintain radio contact. But as they approached the buildings, something felt wrong. Maria couldn't put her finger on it, but her instincts were screaming danger. The place was too quiet, too perfect. Davis, she whispered into her microphone. Something doesn't feel right. Relax, Santos, came his reply. You're just nervous because it's your first real mission. That stung, but Maria pushed the feeling aside. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just being paranoid. The teams split up and began their search. Maria watched from behind a fallen log as the men moved through the camp like shadows. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then Williams's voice crackled through the radio, urgent and scared. Contact, we've got multiple hostiles approaching from the north. Maria spun around and saw them through her binoculars. At least 20 armed men, moving down the mountainside in a coordinated formation. They were trapped. Base, this is Alpha Team, Maria shouted into the radio. We are under attack. Request immediate extraction. Static. Nothing but static. She tried again, switching to the emergency frequency. Still nothing. The radios jammed. She called out to Williams, but he was already firing at the approaching enemies. The next few minutes were chaos. Gunfire erupted from all directions as the terrorist cells surrounded the camp. Maria could hear Davis shouting orders over the radio, but his voice was getting weaker. Martinez screamed that he was hit. Cooper went silent completely. Maria grabbed her rifle and started returning fire. She'd trained for this moment her entire military career, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of combat. The smell of gunpowder, the whistle of bullets flying past her head, the screams of wounded men. Santos, Davis's voice came through her earpiece, weak and desperate. We're pinned down in the main building. They're everywhere. Maria looked around wildly. Williams was lying motionless next to a tree, blood pooling beneath his head. The radio equipment was destroyed by enemy fire. She was alone, surrounded, and cut off from any hope of rescue. But as she crouched behind that fallen log, listening to her teammates' desperate calls for help, something changed inside her. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, something harder, something that had been building up through months of doubt and dismissal. Miguel's voice echoed in her mind. You've got something special, Maria. Maybe it was time to show them what that something was. Maria checked her ammunition, took a deep breath, and started moving toward the main building where her teammates were trapped. She didn't know if she could save them. She didn't know if she'd survive the next 10 minutes, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to hide behind that log while good soldiers died. The little schoolteacher from San Antonio was about to become something else entirely. Maria moved through the forest like a ghost, using every bit of cover the trees provided. The gunfire from the main building was getting weaker, which meant her teammates were running low on ammunition. She had to reach them before it was too late. The terrorist cell had positioned snipers on the surrounding ridges, and she could see their muzzle flashes in the morning light. They had the high ground and superior numbers. This wasn't just an ambush, it was an execution. Maria's radio crackled with fragments of conversation from her trapped teammates. Running low on ammo. Martinez is bleeding bad. Where the hell is our backup? She tried to reach them on the radio, but the jamming was too strong. They probably thought she was dead, just like Williams, just like Cooper, who she'd seen fall near the storage shed. The main building was surrounded by open ground, at least 30 yards of exposed terrain from the closest cover. Maria studied the enemy positions through her scope. 8 men had the building surrounded, with more moving in from the forest. She thought about her training, everything she'd learned about tactics and survival. Then she thought about what Davis and Johnson would do in this situation. They'd probably try some kind of heroic frontal assault, charge in with guns blazing and hope for the best. Maria smiled grimly. They always underestimated her because she was small, because she thought differently, because she was a woman. Time. To use that to her advantage, she spotted a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern side of the camp. It was overgrown with weeds and barely 3 feet deep, but it might be enough. Maria low-crawled through the mud and water, moving inch by inch toward the building. It took her 20 minutes to cover 50 yards, but when she finally reached the corner of the main building, she was completely undetected. She could hear voices inside Davis barking orders, Martinez moaning in pain, Johnson cursing at their situation. Maria peered around the corner and saw 2 terrorists crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, their rifles trained on the building's front entrance. Perfect. She took careful aim with her rifle and fired twice. Both men dropped without making a sound. What was that? One of the other terrorists shouted in accented English. Maria was already moving, sprinting along the back wall of the building to a broken window. She could see Davis and Johnson inside, hunkered down behind overturned tables. Martinez was propped against the wall, pressing a bloody cloth to his shoulder. Davis, she whispered through the window. It's Santos. Davis spun around, his eyes wide with surprise. Santos, how the hell did you get here? Never mind that, Maria said, climbing through the window. How many rounds do you have left? Maybe 2 magazines between us, Johnson said. He looked pale and shaken. All his earlier arrogance was gone. Martinez is hit bad. We've been pinned down for almost an hour. Maria assessed the situation quickly. Martinez needed medical attention, but he could still fight if necessary. Davis and Johnson were uninjured but low on ammunition. The building had good defensive positions, but limited escape routes. Listen to me carefully, Maria said, her voice calm and steady. I counted it, at least 15 hostiles still active. They have snipers on the ridge and a machine gun position near the storage shed, but I think I can get us out of here. How? Davis asked. Maria pointed to a door at the back of the building that leads to a service tunnel that connects to the old mine shaft. I saw it on the geological survey maps. If we can reach the tunnel, we can escape underground. That's crazy, Johnson said. Those tunnels could be collapsed or flooded. Staying here is crazier, Maria replied. They're going to overrun us in the next 10 minutes. Davis looked at Martinez, then back at Maria. For the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to be really seeing her. Not the small woman he'd dismissed, but a soldier who had risked her life to save theirs. What do you need us to do? He asked. Maria felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in months. Respect. Finally, Johnson, you and Martinez get to that back door. Davis, you're with me. We're going to give them something to think about. She moved to the front window and studied the enemy positions. The terrorists were getting ready for a final assault. She could see them massing near the tree line. On my signal, Maria said, Johnson gets Martinez to the tunnel. Davis and I will lay down covering fire for 30 seconds, then follow. What if the tunnel is blocked? Johnson asked. Maria looked at him steadily. Then we die fighting instead of hiding. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Davis nodded grimly. She's right, he said. It's better than waiting here to be slaughtered. Maria positioned herself at the window, rifle ready. She could see the terrorist leader gesturing to his men, organizing the final attack. In her mind, she counted down from 10. Now, she shouted. She opened fire, picking off targets with precision shots while Davis sprayed bullets to keep the enemy's heads down. Behind them, she could hear Johnson helping Martinez toward the back door. Tunnel's clear, Johnson called out. Martinez is through. Maria's rifle clicked empty. She dropped the magazine and slammed in a fresh one, never stopping her rate of fire. Davis was beside her, his face grim with concentration. Go, Maria shouted. I'll cover you. Not without you, Davis replied. For a split second, their eyes met. In that moment, Maria saw something she'd never seen before in Davis's expression. Trust. Complete, absolute trust. Together then, she said, on three. They ran for the back door as bullets shattered the windows behind them. Maria felt something hot graze her arm, but she kept moving. They reached the tunnel entrance just as the terrorists burst through. The front of the building. The tunnel was dark and narrow, carved into solid rock decades ago by miners looking for copper. Martinez was already 50 yards ahead, Johnson helping him navigate the uneven floor. But as Maria stepped into the darkness, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of footsteps, coming from deeper in the tunnel. They weren't the only ones who knew about the mine shaft. The tunnel stretched into blackness ahead of them, and Maria could hear the footsteps getting closer. Someone was coming toward them from the other end. They were trapped between the terrorists behind them and unknown threats ahead. Kill the lights, Maria whispered. They switched off their flashlights and crouched in the darkness. Maria's heart pounded as she listened to the approaching footsteps. Heavy boots. Multiple people, and they were trying to be quiet, which meant they knew someone was in the tunnel behind them. Maria could hear the terrorists entering the tunnel entrance, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Find them. A voice shouted in accented English. They cannot escape. Davis grabbed Maria's arm in the darkness. We're caught in the middle, he whispered. Maria closed her eyes and forced herself to think. The tunnel system was like a maze, with multiple shafts branching off in different directions. If they could find one of the side passages, they might be able to hide until both groups passed by. She remembered studying the mining maps back at base. There should be a ventilation shaft about 100 yards from the entrance. It would be narrow, but they might be able to squeeze through. Follow me, she whispered, feeling along the wall with her hands. Stay close and stay quiet. They moved deeper into the tunnel, with Johnson half carrying Martinez. Maria could feel rough wooden support beams and smell the musty air of decades-old earth. Her fingers traced along the stone wall until she found what she was looking for, a narrow opening barely 3 feet wide. Here, she whispered, pulling Davis toward the side passage. They squeezed into the cramped space just as lights appeared from both directions in the main tunnel. Maria held her breath as voices passed by on either side. Check every passage, the terrorist leader commanded. There's blood on the floor, another voice replied. One of them is wounded. Maria felt sick. Martinez was leaving a trail that would lead them right to their hiding spot. They had maybe 5 minutes before the search reached them. The side passage sloped upward at a steep angle. Maria realized it must lead to one of the old ventilation shafts that opened on the mountainside. If they could reach it, they might be able to escape. Can you climb? She whispered to Martinez. I'll try, he replied through gritted teeth. Started up the passage, moving as quietly as possible. The space was so narrow that they had to crawl single file, with Maria leading the way. Behind them, she could hear voices getting closer. The passage seemed to go on forever. Maria's knees were scraped raw from the rough stone, and her wounded arm throbbed with each movement. But she kept going, driven by the knowledge that her teammates were counting on her. Finally, she saw a faint circle of light ahead, the ventilation shaft. She crawled faster, ignoring the pain in her body. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Maria pulled herself up and out onto the mountainside, then reached back to help the others. Davis came next, then Johnson, and finally Martinez. They were on a narrow ledge about halfway up the mountain, hidden by pine trees and rocky outcroppings. Below them, they could see the mining camp and the terrorists still searching the area. We need to keep moving, Maria said. They'll figure out where we went soon enough. Martinez was getting weaker. The climb through the passage had reopened his wound, and he was losing blood. Johnson ripped strips from his shirt to make a better bandage, but they all knew he needed medical attention soon. The extraction point is 10 miles north, Davis said, checking his compass. Think Martinez can make it? Maria studied their wounded teammate. He was pale and sweating, but his eyes were determined. I can make it, Martinez said. Just give me something to lean on. For the next 6 hours, they moved through the wilderness like hunted animals. Maria used every survival skill she'd learned, picking routes that would be hard to track and finding water sources to keep them going. The terrorists were persistent. Several times, Maria spotted search teams combing the forest below them. Once, they had to hide in a cave for over an hour while a helicopter circled overhead. But Maria kept them moving. She found game trails that were barely visible to the human eye. She led them around rocky areas where they wouldn't leave footprints. She even backtracked twice to confuse their trail. Davis watched her with growing amazement. This wasn't the same woman he'd dismissed as too small and weak for combat operations. This was someone who understood the wilderness better than any of them. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked during one of their brief rest stops. "My grandfather," Maria replied. "He used to take me hunting in the Texas hill country when I was a kid. Said a good tracker could disappear in a parking lot if they had to." As the sun started to set, they reached a ridge that overlooked the extraction point. It was a clearing near a mountain lake, about 2 miles away. But there was a problem. The terrorists had found the extraction point first. Maria counted at least 12 armed men positioned around the clearing. They had obviously monitored military radio frequencies and figured out where the rescue would come from. "Now what?" Johnson asked. Maria studied the situation through her binoculars. The rescue helicopter was scheduled to arrive at dawn. That I gave them about 10 hours to figure out how to take back the landing zone for soldiers. One of them wounded, against 12 well-armed terrorists. The smart thing would be to find another extraction point and call for help. But Maria's radio was destroyed. They had no way to contact base or change the pickup location. If they didn't take back that clearing, the rescue helicopter would fly into an ambush. "We have to warn them," Maria said. "How?" Davis asked. "We don't have communications." Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying the terrorist positions. Then she smiled grimly. "We don't need to warn them," she said. "We need to clear the landing zone ourselves." Johnson stared at her. 4 against 12. "That's suicide." "Not if we're smart about it," Maria replied. "They're expecting a helicopter at dawn. They're not expecting an attack from behind in the middle of the night." Davis looked at her with something approaching. "Or, you want to take them out? All of them?" "I want to go home," Maria said simply. "And I want that helicopter crew to go home too. So yes, we take them out." She was no longer the woman who had been dismissed and underestimated. She was no longer the schoolteacher from San Antonio who had joined the army to honor her brothers. Memory. She was something new, something forged by fire and blood and the absolute determination to protect the people who were counting on her. And the terrorists waiting in that clearing were about to learn what that meant. Maria spent 2 hours studying the terrorist positions through her scope. They had made one critical mistake. They were focused on watching the sky for the incoming helicopter, not the forest around them. She divided the enemy force into 3 groups: for men on the north side of the clearing, 4 on the south, and 4 more positioned near the lakeshore. They had good fields of fire on the landing zone, but their flanks were vulnerable. "Here's what we're going to do," Maria whispered to her teammates. "Martinez, you're going to stay here and provide sniper support. Can you handle that?" Martinez nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. "Just point me at the targets." "Davis and Johnson, you're going to circle round to the south. When you hear my signal, you hit the southern group hard and fast. I'll take the northern position." "What about the group by the lake?" Davis asked. Maria's smile was cold. "Leave them to me." At midnight, they began their approach. Maria moved through the forest like a shadow, using techniques her grandfather had taught her decades ago. Step on rocks, not dirt. Move with the wind, not against it. Become part of the landscape. The first terrorist never knew what hit him. Maria appeared behind him like a ghost, covering his mouth with one hand while her knife found his heart with the other. She lowered his body silently to the ground and moved on to the next position. The second man was harder. He was more alert, constantly scanning the forest around him. Maria had to wait nearly 20 minutes for him to turn his back. When he did, she struck with the same deadly efficiency. 2 down, 10 to go. She found a position with a clear view of both remaining northern guards and the lakeshore group. Then she pulled out her emergency flare and fired it into the sky. The red light burst overhead like a miniature sun, and suddenly the forest erupted with gunfire. Davis and Johnson hit the southern positions exactly as planned, their rifles chattering in the darkness. Maria opened fire on the northern guards, dropping both men with precise shots to the chest. Then she shifted her aim to the lakeshore group, who were running toward the sound of battle. But one of them was faster than the others. He spotted Maria's muzzle flash and returned fire, forcing her to dive for cover behind a fallen tree. Bullets splintered the bark just inches from her head. "Santos," Davis's voice crackled through the radio. "We got 3 of them, but one's heading your way." Maria could hear footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, getting closer. She checked her ammunition for rounds left in the magazine. 1 spare mag on her belt. She'd have to make them count. The terrorist appeared at the edge of the clearing, his rifle sweeping back and forth as he searched for her. Maria held her breath and waited for the perfect shot, but as she squeezed the trigger, another figure emerged from the forest behind him. The terrorist leader, the man who had ordered the ambush at the mining camp. He was bigger than the others, carrying what looked like a military-grade assault rifle. Maria's shot took down the first terrorist, but the leader spotted her immediately. He raised his weapon and opened fire, forcing Maria to roll away from her position. For the next 5 minutes, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse around the clearing. The terrorist leader was good, probably former military. He moved with discipline and fired with accuracy. But Maria had advantages he didn't know about. She knew this terrain better than he did, having studied it for hours. She was smaller and faster, and she was fighting for something more important than money or ideology. She was fighting for the helicopter crew who would arrive at dawn. For Davis and Johnson and Martinez, who had finally learned to trust her. For her brother Miguel, whose memory had driven her to this moment. The terrorist leader made his mistake when he tried to flank her position. He moved too quickly, stepping on a patch of loose gravel that gave away his location. Maria was waiting for him when he rounded the boulder where she'd been hiding. Their eyes met for a split second. His were filled with surprise and fear. Hers were calm and steady. She fired twice. Both shots found their mark. The clearing fell silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the lake shore. "Santos," Davis called out. "You okay?" "All clear," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. They spent the next 3 hours securing the area and treating Martinez's wounds. As the sun began to rise over the mountains, they could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The rescue bird appeared right on schedule, circling the clearing once before settling down in a cloud of dust and pine needles. The crew chief jumped out, his weapon ready, but Maria waved him off. "Landing zone is secure," she called out. "We have one wounded. Priority extraction." As they loaded Martinez onto the helicopter, the crew chief looked around at the bodies scattered throughout the clearing. "What happened here, Sergeant?" he asked. Davis stepped forward. "Sergeant Santos happened," he said simply. "She saved all our lives." The flight back to Fort Reynolds was quiet. Maria sat by the window watching the Montana wilderness roll by below. She thought about the woman who had boarded a helicopter that morning. The woman everyone had doubted and dismissed. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had been tested by fire and found worthy. Someone who had proven that courage had nothing to do with size or gender. Someone who had earned the respect she'd been seeking for so long. When they landed at the base, Captain Wright was waiting on the tarmac. His face was grim as he approached the helicopter. "Sergeant Santos," he said formally, "I need a full debrief on what happened out there." "Yes, sir," Maria replied, but before she could say anything else, Davis stepped forward. "Sir, if I may," he said. "Sergeant Santos led us out of an impossible situation. She's the reason we're all alive. She's the reason your helicopter crew didn't fly into an ambush. And she's the reason 12 terrorists won't be threatening anyone else." Captain Wright looked at Maria with new eyes. "Is that so?" "Sir, I was just doing my job," Maria said. "No," Davis interrupted. "You were doing our jobs. All of them. You were being the soldier we should have seen from the beginning." 2 weeks later, Maria was called to Captain Wright's office. She expected another assignment to communications duty. Another chance to prove herself all over again. Instead, she found orders promoting her to Staff Sergeant and transferring her to Special Operations Command. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant Santos," Captain Wright said. "They want you to help train the next generation of Special Operations soldiers." Maria looked at the orders, hardly believing what she was reading. "Sir, what will I be teaching?" Captain Wright smiled at first. Genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Survival, evasion, and small unit tactics," he said. "Apparently, there are some people in Washington who think you know a thing or two about those subjects." As Maria walked out of the office, she thought about Miguel. He'd been right all along. She did have something special. It had just taken everyone else a while to see it. The schoolteacher from San Antonio was gone. In her place was a soldier who would never again be underestimated by anyone. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, there was a clearing by a lake where 12 terrorists had learned that the hard way.